So welcome to our next instalment in the series on ancient religious skepticism for Classics Confidential. And today I'm in Exeter with Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou, who's Professor of Hebrew Bible and
Ancient
religions, and is also a TV personality. And so Francesca, many of our viewers will be people who are classicists, who know the classical background, but won't know so much about ancient Israel. Could you begin by sketching some of the dates and the key events and that sort of thing?
So the story of the past that's presented in the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament as some people call it, basically spans from about 1400s BCE, so before the Common Era, through to about the 2nd century BCE. That's the story, that's the basic timeline, that not including creation and flood and stories like that. Most scholars would argue that real history begins not with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, not with Moses. More conservative scholars would argue that real history begins about the 10th century BCE, the time of King David and Solomon. Others would argue that actually we can't really talk about real history until a bit later, until about the 8th century BCE. But
so David and Solomon are fictitious figures, they're like Achilles and
a lot of
the Iliad.
Yeah, a lot of scholars would argue otherwise, but increasingly there's more of an opinion that perhaps what we've got about David and Solomon are at best legendary stories. You know, they're maybe like kind of the King Arthur figures, if you like. Okay. I suspect they're more fictitious than historical, personally.
So that's the historical events described by the Bible. And what about the composition of the Bible itself? What kind of date range are we talking about here?
Well, there you go. Biblical scholarship is quite fraught with a dispute and disagreement. For some people, the earliest texts that we have, you know, some of the Psalms might be very ancient. Some other bits of poetry. Yeah, perhaps. Some people would argue even earlier, 12th century BCE, for some of the really early poetry that we find in Deuteronomy, for example. Others would argue that really, when we're talking about the first sort of coherent text, like a book or a scroll, some people say 7th century BCE, perhaps for a first edition, an early edition of some of the texts that we find in the Book of Kings, for example, an early edition of that, perhaps some form of Deuteronomy. Whereas most would agree that most of the compilation of the texts that as we now know them, occurs sometime in the Persian period, so from the 5th century BCE onwards.
Right, okay. And we'll come in due course to the question of whether there is disbelief and scepticism in the world of the Bible. But just to begin with, could you sketch out some of your position on the importance particularly of the Persian period as a formative moment in the Bible? Why is it that this period becomes, what events are conditioning the creation of the Bible as a document in the Persian period?
Theoretically, this is the point at which the elites from Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was basically the capital city of the Kingdom of Judah, this is the point at which the elites who have been exiled to Babylon with the expansion of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the 6th century, they've been exiled to various places, Egypt and Babylon. The Babylonians were defeated by the Persians, and under Cyrus and his successors, you essentially get this idea that all of those displaced communities and populations around the ancient West Asian region are granted permission economically, politically and ideologically by the Persians to return to their homelands.
This is the world of the Cyrus cylinder.
Exactly. Yeah. And so what happens is, according to the Bible, a group of displaced elites from Jerusalem return to the city, rebuild the city, rebuild the Temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem, and rebuild their community. And as a part of that rebuilding of their community, a lot of traditions and perhaps older written sources are reworked and rebranded to create what we would essentially call the beginnings of an emergent Judaism. So this is the point at which you've got a shift in terms of the religious climate from a polytheistic Judahite religion, in which Yahweh is the head god presiding over a number of other deities, to a more monotheistic position in which supposedly Yahweh is the only deity worshipped by these people.
So just to get this absolutely right, you would date monotheism in a more thoroughgoing, intensified form to the Persian period, to the 6th, 5th century, and to this particular community of returning exiles?
It's a very slippery term, monotheism. It's very anachronistic, obviously. These people didn't necessarily believe that no other gods existed but Yahweh. Rather, what we're talking about is the very intensively promoted idea that Yahweh is prioritised over and above all other deities, so much so that those other deities tend to be relegated to lesser roles in the divine realm. And so ostensibly, it's a form of worshipping only Yahweh alone, but there are still other divine beings hanging around.
He's different in kind to the other gods, is he?
Yes.
Transcendent and non...
More increasingly transcendent, increasingly less talkative.
Yeah.
More reliant on heavenly mediators, so that's when you get the beginnings of these kind of angelic figures who are probably relatively demythologised forms of other minor deities that originally had a bigger role to play in a divine council or a divine assembly, but by the time we get to the Persian period, they've kind of been demoted, they're dropping down the tables.
Right, okay, right. And turning to the question of belief and disbelief, I mean, they're very slippery concept and very much contested, I'm aware. Guy Stroomser, in his interview, talked about the way in which questions of belief and disbelief were mobilised more as ways of attacking opponents in a monotheistic world. And he's talking, of course, about late antiquity, where you've got competing monotheisms, you've got Judaism, Christianity and Islam. But the language of disbelief, heresy and so forth is used to attack other peoples. It's not actually necessarily used so much for the community itself. I mean, Christians obviously define themselves as believers, but monotheism doesn't necessitate a concept of belief, is that right? But you can describe other people as disbelievers, or so that the language of disbelief is used as a negative way of stigmatising other groups.
To a certain extent, but in the Hebrew Bible, what you're faced with is this language of belief that just isn't really there. Belief is the language of confession. I believe X, Y, and Z, and it's a very Christian idea to state. It's staking a claim of allegiance and all of the theological trappings that go with that particular religious system. Whereas in the Hebrew Bible, it's not an issue about belief or non-belief. It's about power and potency of the deities. Is one deity stronger than another? Do you worship one deity or do you worship another? So it's much more about both the behaviour, the practice of the gods themselves and how they impact the human realm, and the behaviour and practice of the worshippers themselves and how that impacts the divine realm. So this idea about belief is actually quite alien to the Hebrew Bible.
Yes. But are there certain words, certain brands that are used to stigmatise people that are not part of the monotheistic community that is being defined in this particular world?
Well, the Hebrew Bible is, even though some of the texts and traditions about Yahweh and the other gods may be relatively early, by the time you're in the Persian period, when a lot of these traditions are being reworked and repackaged to suit a more monotheistic perspective, there's an acknowledgement that other gods exist, obviously, because how do you say that Yahweh is the one true God if you're not trying to compete with the idea that there are other gods
there
around?
Are other gods or other false gods?
Well, that's the thing. The gods who are worshipped by other people, who tend to be caricatured very much as sort of Canaanites or foreigners, these are the gods that were indigenous to Yahweh and his whole pantheon, and indigenous to ancient Israelite and Judahite religions. But they are vilified and they are othered by being made foreign. And by being made foreign, they're being made, as some texts call them false gods, but really they're no gods. So in other words, they're demonised and ridiculed. They're vilified as manufactured objects. These are cult statues that are made by human hands. They don't eat, they don't breathe, they don't speak, they can't hear, they can't stand, they can't act. So therefore they're impotent. Whereas Yahweh is the God who speaks and listens and hears and acts and does.
And this is where the whole question of Israelite religion as aniconic becomes important, is it? Because Israelite religion has a God which is not represented by human form. It's not represented by human creation.
Theoretically, yeah. So although you've got the prohibition of images in the Ten Commandments, lots of scholars think that this was probably either a later sort of development or was a part of a competing tradition. You could have an aniconic representation of a god, a material representation of a god, like a standing stone, for example, that's aniconic, so there's not actually imaged or sculpted.
Right.
So there are forms of aniconic Yahweh worship, there's evidence of forms of aniconic Yahweh worship in various periods, but it's in the Persian period that you get this real push towards aniconism, so no images at all. And so yeah, two reasons for that. Firstly, having a cult image is a pretty dangerous thing to have, because competing peoples, invading armies could come into your temple and they'd godnap your deity, and destroy his cult statue, mutilate his cult statue, and so physically and materially disempower that deity. So if you get rid of your cult statue, then your god is not at risk of being godnapped and cut up, basically. So that's one reason to move away from having a cult statue of a god in the first place. Another reason is that if you've got a cult statue of a deity, that god can be present in more than one sanctuary, and therefore you're risking, from a monotheistic perspective, pluralization. So Yahweh's cult statue in Samaria might be considered a different deity from Yahweh's cult statue in Jerusalem. So if you're pushing a monotheistic agenda, get rid of cult statues so that you can eliminate risk of pluralism.
Sure, yes.
Then the other reason is very much that cult statues are what other religions have, and other deities are represented by cult statues. We see this all over the Mediterranean and ancient West Asia. So differentiate your God by saying, our God isn't a God made by human hands, our God isn't created by a human artisan. In fact, our God is the cosmic artisan. He created the world, he created the universe, he created us, and he created all foreigners.
So the Hebrew Bible has very well developed strategies for marking forms of false religion, or demonising other
competing religions.
Yes, I mean what it would present as false religion.
Careful.
Is there any sign in the Bible of anxiety that people might not believe in the true God Yahweh?
Absolutely. There's a lot of debate and discussion in the Hebrew Bible, texts like the Book of Job, in which you've got the idea that our God doesn't seem to be all he's cracked up to be. So Job is a really classic example. It's probably a Persian period, at the earliest, a Persian period composition in the form that we have it now. And the Book of Job is about an innocent guy. He's very righteous, loves Yahweh, do anything for him, to the point of almost anal behaviour. And as a result of a wager between Yahweh and another member of his divine council, who later becomes known as the Satan, but is actually a goody in the Hebrew Bible, they decide to punish Job. So they kill his family, except for his wife. They get rid of all his riches and his wealth. They afflict him with what seems to be a nasty skin disease. And the whole point is, why is he suffering? Why does bad stuff happen to good people? Either God is not in control of the world, therefore he's not very powerful, or God is not just, and therefore what kind of a God is that? So the book is debating, one of the issues it's debating is the idea about what is the relationship between God, Yahweh, and humans, and why is it that sometimes shit happens? And really the book leaves it relatively unresolved. The book ends up by saying, God's really busy doing this whole creation thing and kind of keeping the powers of chaos in check. And yes, you're important, but you're only a human. So you need to get a bit of perspective and just trust that actually God does know what he's doing, although it might not seem like it at the time.
Now, I suspect you'll resist the phrasing of this question, but is there a way in which you could see the Book of Job as grappling with what we now call the problem of evil, the question of how religious communities can actually deal with the idea that an omnipotent, good deity will permit evil in the world?
In the sense, it's dealing with a form of that debate about the problem of evil. I mean, obviously, this is a text that's written before the onset of Christianity, and that whole philosophical tradition about the problem of evil is very much a Western Christianized debate that's been going on obviously for centuries and centuries. So with that caveat in place, it is trying to deal with the question of why do bad things happen, but there isn't so much a sense that Yahweh in this text, or indeed in any other Hebrew Bible text, is inherently good. There's a sense in which there is a goodness in the created order, but a goodness that's aesthetically pleasing, that's balanced and well measured and judged. That doesn't mean to say that God himself is always benevolent. Right. There's very much a sense that, if you behave badly, you will be punished. But equally, if human beings behave badly, that can have a negative impact on the divine world and on the cosmos as well. So human beings have to act ethically to one another. It's what goes on in community can have as detrimental effect on the cosmos as what the gods might do. So it's about the problem of evil. But rather than resolving it, other scholars would disagree with me, but I think rather than resolving that question in the Book of Job, what the Book of Job is actually trying to do is to say it's better to question, rather than just accepting everything at face value and say, well, that's just the world is, you know. It's better to question and challenge God, which is what Job ends up doing. He basically calls God to a trial, tries to get him in the witness box. But Job hasn't got a hope in hell, pardon the pun. He hasn't got a hope in hell of quizzing God in a way that makes God look like a loser. Because the book is essentially, God isn't a loser, he is in control. You might not like what happens, but that's the way the world is. But haven't we had a really interesting journey thinking about what is the nature of God and what is the nature of his relationship with humanity? It's much better to question and challenge and come to a faith and a belief in God that is comfortable with the idea of something that's unsettled and contradictory and unpredictable, than come to a very simplistic idea of God just being this good guy, sat in the heavens, wanting the best for his creation. So
I'm just trying to get a feel for what you think this particular book of the Bible is trying to achieve. Do you think it's a sort of reflective, almost, I mean, again, this word philosophical would be perhaps the wrong word to use generically, but it's not a didactic, top-down, dogmatic view of the world that it's trying to enforce on people. It's trying to get people to meditate on these kind of questions that are that afflict anyone who's part of a religious community that depends on belief in the supernatural.
The way I see the Book of Job is that it stands somewhere on the spectrum, but a long line of ancient West Asian traditions in which it's much better to question and to dispute and to juxtapose different ideas than to have a very sort of unified, coherent, but ultimately contentless understanding of your faith, which is why the rabbinic tradition is so important, because there again, you know, you've got different rabbis who are, you know, completely at odds about how to interpret certain ideas, certain biblical passages. And Job, in a way, in itself, it's a juxtaposition of materials from poetry and prose to competing ideas about the nature of God and how God behaves and how human beings behave. And it's this idea that within Judaism itself, even at this very early period, when Job is likely being put together in the form we have it now, that difference is all right, juxtaposition is all right, and let's, you know, if the biblical writers are comfortable with that, then I think maybe we should be a bit more comfortable with that sense of difference and juxtaposition.
It sounds like there's a tension between two different processes. I mean, at the start you were talking about centralization and the way in which monotheism emerges as a result of a particular moment when an elite are trying to get control of the centre of power, the temple and so forth. But that is conjoined with a more pluralistic, if that's the right word to use, view of the world that you get in the Book of Job, which is more open to question and to debate and so forth. That there are two things going on here. One is sort of controlled centralisation, the other is thinking around problems and allowing for multiple points of entry into this.
Yeah, but they're quite different in some ways. I mean, just because you've got this kind of, I mean, it's a very broad brushstroke way to say you've got this centralisation of Yahweh worship in the Persian period in the Jerusalem temple. Because all the way through its history before that, the Jerusalem temple is not only home to, it's home to other deities as well as Yahweh, but it also is competing with other temples as well. You know, temples at Bethel, for example, Bethel was one of its main competitors, economically and politically, as well as religiously. But even within that centralisation process in Jerusalem, we've got suggestions in biblical texts that there were competing groups. Some people would put it quite crudely to say there was a difference between a prophetic group and a priestly group. Other people say that we had different priestly groups vying for control. So in some ways, yes, there's a kind of a certain pattern that emerges about Jerusalem being the focus of the sole worship of Yahweh. But on the other hand, the Book of Job isn't that bothered about other deities. So what's going on in Jerusalem is about not just about Yahweh, but it's about his relationship with other deities as well. But what's going on in the Book of Job is that Job isn't bothered about other deities. There are other deities. When the first two chapters, we have a scene in which Yahweh is in his divine council, this like divine throne room, if you like, and all the other gods come to the meeting. It's like, this is just the way that you know, religion works. That's how the heavenly business works, is that all the gods come to a big meeting, Yahweh sat there, or whichever the head deity is, you know, calling people to order, asking the gods to speak. So Job isn't worried about polytheism. So there is already this kind of polytheistic backdrop to his story about Yahweh. What he's more concerned about is Yahweh as the creator God. He's top God, and everything is in his control, including the other deities. So it's not quite a monotheistic text in that sense either. So, you know, some people would argue you don't actually get to monotheism until, you know, well, you've still got angelic beings and demons and all those other kind of divine beings hanging around. You can't really talk about monotheism at all. So, you know, Christianity, from my perspective, doesn't look that monotheistic, nor does Islam, and to a certain extent nor does Judaism today.
Yes, yeah.
But I guess that's for another discussion.
It probably is, but thank you very much for your time and for a fascinating discussion.
Pleasure.